Okay, hello everyone, and firstly, thank you very much to everyone who responded and sent in questions for this assembly, right? I'm going to try and rattle through as many of them as I possibly can, very, very quickly, in the small amount of time I've got for this assembly. If you need any more information or you want any further detail, you have an amazing biology teacher who you can ask in lessons, or there's more on all of these questions on the YouTube channel down there, Mr. Gill's Science Stuff, and if that sounds like a shameless plug for my YouTube channel, it is. So, moving on. Right, first up, this question came in quite a bit, particularly from year 8. When will under 18s get the vaccine? Well, the simple answer is we don't know. There is no guidance on this. There is no certainty. We are moving into phase 2 of the vaccination schedule at the moment, which basically will take us from sort of 49-year-olds down to 18-year-olds by summertime. There are specific trials underway just to check the safety of all these vaccines in under 18s. They're happening in London, in Southampton and Bristol. There is no reason to think that the vaccine would work any differently in children than it would in adults, but it needs testing. And as you can see, the government's been pouring all sorts of cold water on the idea of getting vaccinated under 18s, but I think it would probably start with teenagers and work its way down. Okay, this is the official guidance. As you can see, phase 2 is basically 49 to 40-year-olds down to 18-year-olds, and as you can see, this bit down here on children pretty much says as evidence becomes available, it will be reviewed and advice offers as appropriate. So we don't know, watch this space is basically where it is with that. Right, next question. This came from a number of people as well, but particularly the first one was a member of year 8. What is the difference between the vaccines? And the answer is, well, they're all kind of doing the same thing. They're all training your immune system to recognize the coronavirus spike protein, which is this red thing here, but they're just delivering that information in different ways. So a bit of a biology lesson for you here. Of course, it was always going to be that way. This is a normal cell, right? Normal cells have DNA in the nucleus, as you should know. That DNA basically contains all the information for making you. When a gene is switched on, a message, right, a messenger molecule, which the older students amongst you might know is called RNA, gets taken to a ribosome, and that's a protein machine, right, and that manufactures whatever protein it's told to. What the vaccine is doing is actually inserting, right, the information for how to make a protein, a spike protein, make those red proteins on coronavirus, so your cell makes those proteins, okay? The ribosome then switches to making coronavirus proteins, to making COVID proteins, and expresses them on its surface. It doesn't mean you have coronavirus or anything like that. It just means that your immune system can practice and make the antibodies and get ready for when the real deal comes along, so it will know what it's facing, okay? Right, that's basically what they're all doing. The only thing that's different is how this message gets delivered. Okay, so basically it's the difference between parcel force and Royal Mail. So essentially what we've got here, look, is two different methods, right? The one at the top here is the Pfizer vaccine. That's basically a raw bit of the RNA, which is up there in like a bubble of cell membrane that just sort of fuses with your cell. And the AstraZeneca one here, which uses the shell of a chimpanzee cold virus, okay, a chimpadenovirus, okay? Which one should you get? Well, basically, there's been a lot of talk about this, particularly about the AstraZeneca one, which we'll come on to, but it doesn't matter at all. It makes no difference whatsoever, right? Take a vaccine if you're offered one. They're both really, really good. The data on them is much, much better than we could ever have helped. So thanks very much, vaccine manufacturers. Another massive success like polio, diphtheria, tetanus, measles, mumps, so on and so forth. Right, these questions came in for a number of different people across primarily year 8 and year 9 about boosters and different strains. So will the development of different strains of coronavirus mean the vaccine at some point isn't effective? Will we need a booster each year? The answer is maybe, right? What viruses tend to do is they tend to evolve when they get into a human population to become more infectious, which we've seen, but less deadly. Because from a virus evolution point of view, if you kill your host immediately, how are you being transmitted on? So the viruses that survive are the ones that kind of fly under the radar. So over time, viruses tend to get less and less and less deadly, but more transmissible, okay? Then the question becomes, is it going to be worth it designing vaccines for what COVID becomes, okay? There's lots of important information from Oxford and from Pfizer that an updated vaccine would be really, really easy to manufacture, really easy to make now they've got the technology, but will it be worth it? For example, we do vaccinate against flu, seasonal flu, we don't vaccinate against colds. So that'll have to be a judgment based on how this virus evolves. Okay, next one, will there be another lockdown? The answer is maybe, okay? There might be, reasons why there might be, winter causes spikes in respiratory diseases. Reasons why there might not be, however, is the vaccine program, the so-called herd immunity, we'll come on to in a moment, and the fact we're all much better at preventing diseases. We're all much better at being hygienic, okay? So herd immunity is quite a word that's been bandied around a lot, but you actually need an awful lot of the population to be vaccinated to create it. It basically means that the virus doesn't have anywhere to go because the whole herd is resistant. Okay, as you can see, viruses rip through 0% vaccinated populations, but when we come up here to 95% and only the little blue dots there are the unvaccinated ones, they find it much harder to transmit. But it basically means that everybody needs to take their vaccines, okay? And you must remember you are part of the herd, so if you're offered a vaccine, you take it. Okay, now next question, how has Sweden done with no lockdown? Well, this came from a year 10 and it's not actually true that Sweden hasn't had any sort of lockdown. I have a family member in Stockholm and he's been working from home since March, okay? But certainly they've had a much looser approach to lockdown than we have. Now, if you look at the figures here, you can see, you might think, well, they've got about a quarter roughly of our cases, and this one here, we've got the deaths obviously is about a tenth, but you need some context for that, okay? You need to know how many people are there in the UK and how many people are in Sweden. So in the UK, we've got a total population of 67.8 million people in a space of about 250,000 kilometres squared, okay? So we're quite crammed in, okay, certainly in city areas. Sweden is a much smaller population in a much bigger area. Now, of course, they're also crammed they're not all spread out perfectly. They're all crammed into the cities, you know, your Malmös, your Stockholms, all that kind of stuff, right? But if we did a really basic bit of maths and multiplied up sort of the 10.3 million up to what it would be like if there were 67.8 million, what we would actually see is the cases would be much higher than the UK's, suggesting that lockdown does work, right? That we've actually saved, you know, about 2 million-ish cases by our lockdown. Obviously a very rough comparison. And deaths here would be at 91,245. Now, that could be for any different reasons, demographics of their population, the fact they have been investing in their healthcare for the last 10 years where the UK really hasn't, could be a number of different reasons. But please don't think, you know, no lockdown, Sweden's done fine. It really hasn't, particularly not at the moment. Cases in Sweden are rising up a lot at the moment. And if you say there's been no lockdown in Sweden, there has been a lockdown, it's just not been as formal or enforced as in the UK, okay? So a little bit more of a nuanced picture there than sometimes presented. Right, are lateral flow tests accurate? Excellent question there from another member of Year 8. Basically, yes, but they answer the question they're designed to, and that question is there enough COVID antigen, is there enough COVID spike protein on this swab to glue two sets of antibodies together? If you want to know how they work, there's plenty of other videos on the YouTube channel, but for now, essentially, we have to make the point that they're not answering directly the question everyone wants them to. They're not answering the question, am I infected or infectious? They're not answering, have I had COVID? They're not answering, will I develop symptoms in the near future? And they're not answering, can I go out or hug granny? They're not designed to answer those questions. So if we look at this graph, it'll show you what I'm talking about. This line here is the detectable threshold for the amount of COVID you would have to have, okay? Now this graph looks at antibodies rather than antigens, but the shapes are the same, right? This red line here, look, is the SARS-CoV-2 ones. So this is basically when you have a disease and you are infectious. But there's only enough COVID to kick off the lateral flow testing between these, underneath this line, when it's higher than the detectable threshold, okay? If you did a lateral flow test over here, right, then you would obviously test negative, and then maybe in a couple of days you start to develop symptoms. That's why we ask you to do multiple ones over multiple days so that you catch this big bit here in the middle. So if we're actually asking the question, do they answer the question that they're designed to do, then yes, they do. But do they answer the am I infectious and can I go out question? Well, there's no test in the world that's designed to directly answer that question. Right, next, when will mask wearing in schools end? The answer is, again, we don't know. The latest guidance from the Department for Education says this: subject to roadmap process as part of step 3, we expect these precautionary measures to be no longer recommended. This would be no earlier than the 17th of May and will be confirmed with 1 week's notice. So basically, it's not going to be before the next set of lockdown easings, and they'll let us know when we can, okay? So we don't know. That information has to come from the government to us, right? But I will say a word in protection, in defence of masks. I know it's annoying having to wear masks all over the school and in lessons and all that kind of stuff, but they do work, right? And you might think, well, the viruses are really small, they can just go straight through them. But crucially, they stop you touching your nose and your mouth. They catch droplets of moisture coming from your nose and your mouth, which are big enough to be stopped by the mask and carry the viruses. The cumulative effect of everybody wearing masks is actually very positive, right? They affect things on a population level. So if you're thinking, well, you know, I will probably be okay, I probably don't need to wear a mask, then you're being selfish, right? They help others, right? And on a population level, people have been doing this in South and Eastern Asia for years, right? This is a picture from, I think, from 2018 in South Korea of people as a standard precautionary principle wearing masks to protect the general population, okay? And if we go back in history, this is Spanish flu, right? It's a Spanish flu here where we've got everybody wearing a mask. I particularly like that sign over there, wear a mask or go to jail. But this lady here also proves that even as per now, even 100 years ago, there were some people who didn't know how to wear a mask correctly over both the nose and the mouth, please. So if you don't believe me that they do actually work, here's another little bit of evidence from nature, right? The red line here is standard colds, rhinoviruses over 2020 versus standard colds 2019, okay? As you can see, 1 here is kind of where lockdown started in 2020, 2 is where lockdown was eased, and 3 is where the schools came back. And as you can see, we've actually got much, much lower flu and cold rates, showing that lockdowns, mask wearing, increased hygiene really, really do work for respiratory illnesses. Okay, right. How are we answering the clotting question? I'm going to deal with them very, very quickly because it's a complicated one. Simple answer, we're basically looking for correlations. Longer term, we'll come up with some hypotheses and do standard scientific testing and some quality sciencing to try and find, okay, if there is a correlation, how does it work? But for now, we've really got to think about this in context of how common clots actually are. The answer is pretty common, right? 20 million AstraZeneca vaccines have been given in the UK so far as of the 21st of April, about that amount. 79 people have been basically found to have, in that group, to have blood clotting issues, okay? The normal rate in the background of population, which comes from this link, is 1 person per 1,000 per year, okay? So let's do some quick maths to compare those numbers. 79 out of 20 million vaccinated, so normally we'd expect 1 in 1,000 per year. So 20 million people, out of that, we would expect maybe 20,000 clotting events in a year. But the vaccine hasn't existed for a year, it's only existed for a third of the year. So we cut that number into 3, okay? That gives us 6,667 expected clotting events within the population in the time that we've had, okay? But you might say this was particularly young people who are getting these clots. Okay, we can find information on that as well, right, from this link here. Apparently that drops it by a factor of 10, right? If you're under 40, you're 10 times less likely than the rest of the population. But that still means we would expect, just with nothing else happening, to have 667 expected cases out of 20 million who've been vaccinated. And in fact, we've seen 79. Okay, so those numbers obviously are a very rough comparison, and there is an issue about this rare type of clotting, but that is being looked into. The advice though is, you gotta have the vaccine. It is still a minuscule risk compared to lots of other really, really normal drugs like the contraceptive pill and aspirin that mess with blood clotting as well. Last question, and I'm not going to give a yes/no answer to this one because there isn't one, okay? And this was from a year 11. Has the government handled the pandemic well? So I googled around this. I'm just going to present you with a series of facts that I found that are in good and bad, okay? Now, the fact the bad box is bigger, don't read anything into that. It's a pandemic. Most things about pandemics are bad, okay? So in terms of good successes, fast vaccine rollout, effective vaccine development, best virus genome sequencing is right here in the UK. We know more about the disease than we did. The NHS didn't fully collapse. We obviously kept our oxygen supplies and kept the hospitals open. Treatment and survival rate drastically improved throughout the pandemic so far. Nightingale Hospital construction was good. Staffing was another issue. Furlough protected some jobs. Obviously, that's a good thing. In terms of the bad side, every lockdown was late compared to expert advice. No restrictions on Christmas, and we came back for that one day in January. The headline figure, of course, is there's close to 130,000 people dead. That's 0.2% of the entire population of the country, and a failure to protect care homes. The Health Secretary was found to have acted unlawfully by improper contract awarding. No airport restrictions for a year, so people coming in and out of the UK as they liked. Very low compliance with isolation rules for both enforcement and economic reasons. £37 billion was spent on the test, track and trace programme as a private contract and was judged to have had little effect. Exclusion of local public health experts at the start of the pandemic. The PM missed multiple important COBRA meetings and reported as very, very confusing messaging around COVID at the beginning of the pandemic. Okay, so obviously those all have context. You can go and look into any of those and come to your own conclusion about that. Okay, so the lessons to take away from this, and the ones I want you to take away, are take a vaccine when offered. Follow the social distancing and mask wearing rules. These are very important, right? Be considerate of the whole population, not selfish, because fundamentally you are part of the herd. Thank you very much for listening.